The signature issue of your campaign and the idea for which you're becoming so well known is this idea of a universal basic income, what you call a freedom dividend. So for those who might not be familiar with your campaign or this idea, can you tell us a bit more about this and particularly how you see it as a potential remedy for multiple problems that America is facing?
Thank you, Claire. So I'm going to retrace my steps a little bit, though that bio does a pretty good job. But when I was your age here in college, segue quickly, a couple of my dear friends and colleagues graduated from this school, so I have very, very warm thoughts towards the College of Charleston. This place produces awesome people. At Venture for America, the organization you mentioned, I think our third or fourth hire was someone who just graduated from College of Charleston, literally like a year or two before, and she ended up growing an entire department. So I've had very positive associations with this place even before I saw it in person. So I spent 7 years running a nonprofit called Venture for America, but when I was your age, I was just trying to do well in school. I took the LSAT, went to law school. How many of you are thinking of doing that? Wow, I kind of suspected.
Yeah.
So you should know that that's a shakier path than it was than in my day. And in my day, you went to school, you got loaded up with $130,000 in debt, but then you are at least relatively assured of a high-paying job at the other end. Now the debt is there, it's actually a little higher, but the high-paying job may or may not be there. I mean, that's just the tough truth of what's going on in the legal field. So I went to law school, I practiced law for 5 unhappy months, and then I left to start a business. How many of you are thinking about trying to start a business at some point? It's great, it's hard. So my business failed. My parents told people I was still a lawyer because, Asians. But I'd been bitten by the bug, and I said, okay, let me try and get better at this. So I worked at another startup and then another, and then I became the head of an education company that I grew to become #1 in the United States and was bought by a bigger company in 2009. So this was the height of my entrepreneurial career, but 2009 was a really tough time in a lot of the country. And if you're a bit older, so let's call it a non-student, you remember how rough 10 years ago was, where the financial crisis was devastating many communities, and I thought I had some insight as to why this crisis had unfolded. It was because a lot of the whiz kids I'd gone to Exeter and Brown and Columbia with had headed to Wall Street and come up with exotic financial instruments and derivatives and mortgage-backed securities and helped crash the economy. So I thought, okay, that's a train wreck. What would you rather people do aside from head to Wall Street or now Silicon Valley and try and become an Excel jock or the next app king or whatnot. And so I thought, well, ideally, you would want them to head to Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis, Birmingham, Cleveland, and start businesses. But I knew that that's too high a bar for just about anyone because you can't just like move to a place and start a business unless you've got a whole lot of things going for you. And so I thought, well, maybe they could do what I did, which is work for a more experienced entrepreneur for a couple of years as their apprentice or lieutenant. And then at the end of a couple of years, if they wanted to start a business, then we'd try and help them do so. So I thought, well, this sounds like Teach for America for startups. Like, that's a great idea. What do you call that? Venture for America. I'm not very imaginative, as you can tell. So I put in some of my own money to start Venture for America. Then I started calling rich friends with this question: do you love America? And then the smart among them said, what does it mean if I say yes? And then I said, at least $10,000. And then 12 of them said, I love America for $10K. I was like, I thought you did. And so we started with a couple 100,000 that grew to the millions, helped create several thousand jobs around the country over 7 years. Very, very proud of the work I did with Venture for America. But I saw firsthand the aftermath of the automation of manufacturing jobs in Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, and other cities around the country. And I was staggered by the gulf between regions, where when you fly between St. Louis and San Francisco, or Michigan and Manhattan, you feel like you're crossing dimensions and decades and ways of life, and not just a few time zones. And then Donald Trump became our president in 2016. And we all have friends and family that were very excited about that outcome. I do. To me, it was a giant red flag that tens of millions of Americans decided to take a bet on the narcissist reality TV star. It said, okay, things are really not going well for a lot of people. They don't feel like they're being served well by our government, which I get. And so I looked at it and said, okay, how did this happen? And I realized that my work and why this had happened were directly tied together, where we've automated away 4 million manufacturing jobs in Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Missouri, Iowa, all of the swing states that Trump won. And now what we did to those jobs, we're doing to retail jobs, call center jobs, fast food jobs, truck driving jobs, and on through the US economy. How many of you have noticed self-serve kiosks in a fast food restaurant? They're going to be in every McDonald's location in the next 2 years. How many of you have seen retail stores closing? Amazon's closing 30% of America's stores and malls and paying zero in federal taxes. So I looked up and realized the enormity of this fourth industrial revolution that's already tearing our country apart. And our news media either doesn't understand it or doesn't want to talk about it. We're scapegoating immigrants for problems immigrants have nothing to do with. So I'm figuring all this out in 2017, and I go to Washington, D.C., and I say, what are we going to do to help people transition through the fourth industrial revolution? And they wanted nothing to do with it. Literally, the answers I got were, number one, we cannot talk about that. Number two, we should study that further. And number three, we must educate and retrain all Americans for the jobs of the future. And I said, that last one sounds great, but I looked at the studies. Do you all want to guess how effective the government-funded retraining programs were for the manufacturing workers in the Midwest who lost their jobs? Go ahead, throw a number out. Yeah, I'm anchoring you low because it is low. It's 0 to 15%. They're a total dud. And then when I said that to the folks in DC, they said, well, I guess we'll get better at it. So these are the solutions that are coming out of Washington, and the truth is they don't care. There was a person in DC who said something that led me to run for president. He said, Andrew, you're in the wrong town. No one here is going to do anything about this because fundamentally DC is a town of followers, not leaders. And the only way we will do anything about it is if you were to create a wave in other parts of the country and bring that wave crashing down on our heads. And I said, challenge accepted. I'll be back in 2 years. Because that was 2 years ago, and here we are. So the question is, how do we help our people manage this transition? And this is back to your original question, Claire, which is this $1,000 a month for every American. And I know the first time you heard it, it sounded like a gimmick or a joke. But the truth is, this idea has been with us since our founding. Thomas Paine was for it. Called it the citizen's dividend. Martin Luther King fought for it, and it was what he was fighting for when he was assassinated in 1968. Called it the guaranteed minimum income for all Americans. And one state has had a dividend for almost 40 years, where now everyone in that state gets between $1,000 and $2,000 a year, no questions asked. And what state is that?
Alaska.
And how do they pay for it?
Oil.
And what is the oil of the 21st century? Technology, AI, big data, software, self-driving cars and trucks. Right now, Amazon, closing 30% of America's stores and malls, trillion-dollar company paying zero in taxes. Does that sound like a sustainable arrangement to you all? No, it's terrible. It's like, and it's not their fault, it's our fault. We're so dumb and so bought and sold by these companies that we're like, oh, you're paying zero in taxes? Well, I guess you follow the rules, like moving right along. We have structural problems that are very, very deep. And the way we actually rewrite the rules of the 21st century economy to work for people is by making us all owners and shareholders in the innovations and gains. And if anyone suggests to you that we do not have the money, again, just say, look, Amazon's a trillion-dollar tech company paying zero in taxes. You know, we have the money. It's just none of it's coming to us. Like, being a retail clerk's the most common job in South Carolina and most of the country. What is the 39-year-old woman who works at that store making $9 to $10 an hour going to do when her store closes? Like that is the product of Amazon's hoovering up this much value over time. And Amazon's paying zero back into the system. That woman's going to see none of it. So what we have to do is we have to actually start spreading the gains from innovation and progress as broadly as possible, and that's what the freedom dividend would do. In real terms, $1,000 a month in each of your hands. How many of you would find that to be a positive difference maker in your lives? Yeah, and if you don't have your hand up, then I don't. Then you must be very, very well off. And one of the jokes I tell is that, like, if $1,000 a month would make no difference in your life, then you probably should have no problem with other people getting it. And I do know people that resemble that, and most of them I'm happy to say are on board, even the ones that would be paying, in some cases, hundreds of millions of dollars into the system. I've been endorsed by Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Sam Altman, Alexis Ohanian, all these tech giants who know that this is going to hurt their pocketbook, but they think that we have bigger interests at heart. That it's a very, very bad environment for innovation if more and more Americans feel left behind.
And so your idea, just to build on that, is that this $1,000 then comes back into the economy, if I'm correct in
100%.
understanding that.
Because when you get this money, thank you, South Carolina, when you get this money, how are you going to spend it in real life?
Paper towels?
Rent, paper towels, down the street.
I need that today.
If you're a student here, probably school costs, tuition payments. Retirement. But how much of it's going to stay here in South Carolina? Most of it. A little bit of it's going to float up to the cloud. You know, you'll actually get your own Netflix account instead of just using your friend's password. But most of it would go right here into the stuff of life, to car repairs and daycare and Little League signups and local businesses. This is the trickle-up economy from our people, our families, and our communities up. And this would work 100%. And it's one reason why some of the big companies also are in favor of this, because they know they'll get more business out of it. One person who is in favor of a variant of this plan is Jamie Dimon, the CEO of JP Morgan Chase. Do you think that Chase is going to have some more banking customers if everyone's getting $1,000 a month? Sure. Target, you know, AT&T, maybe you'll upgrade to Verizon. I don't know. I'm just like,
Do I get a free phone?
You know what I mean? Like, it's like businesses win. It's a trickle-up economy. It's a virtuous cycle.
Are all y'all paying attention? Automation gonna sweep the nation unless we get him in. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend. Climate change is real again. Science rules. Teachers bringing home some bread. Medicare for every citizen. Andrew Yang, 2020 freedom dividend.